So I had two items to talk about for us this week. Both are related to sort of the central STOD and the refactoring for when the control plane is not present. So let me go through those. I sort of wrote them up as work in progresses, but since that's what I have, I just want to sort of, I don't know if I should mark them in review or mark it as a review, and then we'll just talk about it. Do we have Costin here? I see no. So this won't be a full review. This will be to make sure this document is the right thing for when we get Costin to sort of agree with it. So when we talked about central STOD, Costin made the point that, well, some of our commands need access to the control plane and some do not. When you do an install of Istio control plane, you need access to the control plane. When you do something like cube inject, you do not. And I had done this analysis of which commands talk to the control plane, but I hadn't sort of explained sort of the reasons or what they are. So I just made a simple table breaking down all of the istio commands by the expected user privilege. So these are the commands that admins do, and it's on one page. And the functionality is all over the board. So Control Z, which only an admin dashboard, install, only an admin does, is a main command, and manifest, apply, or is hiding under manifest. Diff doesn't really require permissions, but is useless without them. This is my list of the admin commands. Some of them, like version, and I forgot, and post install, are sort of done by users as well. So these are commands that I believe actual Istio users would use to troubleshoot their problems with the mesh. Analyze, bringing up the Envoy dashboard, proxy config to make sure that the proxy has the version, just to see if they're on an Istio version, so they know what documentation to consult. Post install to see if Istio is still running, maybe, maybe not. So these are the commands that we think users do. And again, they're all spread out. We didn't create a nice hierarchy of admin commands versus user commands. The only command I couldn't figure out, well, the version appears on both lists, but the command I couldn't figure out was Kiali, because I don't actually know how Kiali is going to fare under central STOD. I don't think it uses debug APIs, but so maybe you can believe things, so I'm not sure if it's going to work. So the first big question, and I don't know if we have Stephen here, he really was pushing us to put things in the roles of personas, which is very similar to how Costin wanted us to break things down. We don't have a way to indicate what these commands are. We should certainly add something to the short description for the commands. Operator init obviously is not something a user normally does. Maybe we need some way to indicate that. But perhaps also the hierarchy is wrong and we need to move towards something better, or break istio into two commands, Istio admin and Istio cuddle. Any thoughts on that?
I'm thinking, I don't know what it's called within the commands. Our commands are grouped into subcommand structure. Structure.
Right, so the problem, of course, is scripts are using them on their old locations, but yes.
Yeah, we can do
So it
aliasing
would be,
to make them still work the old way as well. This would just be another alias effectively.
um, I think it would help a user not to see all of the commands. An administrator is unclear. In Stephen's persona document, we had a notion of a cloud operator who's mostly installing and upgrading Istio as being different from um, an admin who's sorting out problems like why proxy status is incorrect. Um, it'd be nice, though, for the persona to mostly show the commands you normally use. So some way to filter them. If you're a user, you shouldn't be seeing all the install commands.
So question on this, do we know if kubectl does that already to, based on your role, to show you the commands that's relevant to your role?
It does not. There's nothing in there that knows about your role, except impersonate a user. I mean, there's commands to give yourself less roles. So I'm the admin of my clusters. I can impersonate a different user or a service account, but there's nothing that makes the help text hide from me the things based on what I would be allowed to do.
Yeah, you just get permission denied.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think. Which one would be more user friendly? Either we display what they are allowed to execute, or we just fail when they attempt to execute.
So I'm thinking we need like a config to hide all these admin commands, especially if, you know, as cloud operators, we don't expose, install, upgrade. We don't want them using Control Z because they can't. A bunch of commands you can't touch is frustrating. So either at compile time, we generate a special user istioctl, or there's some kind of flag, environment flag, or a config file for this. I think it would help. I think it'd be frustrating to see, to not be able to know like that there's a manifest migrate that you can't use. So this work was done again because I'm terrified that we're not going to get the stuff for Central Istio to be done for 1.7. So here I'm recreating my analysis of what the current commands that talk to the control plane are. These are the commands that are going to break under Central Istio D until we fix them. And the good news is I've been working on proxy status, and I have a PR for most of proxy status using the new way. But in this part of the document, I'm talking about the changes, the old versus the new. So in 1.6, we have this debug endpoint syncz that we use for proxy status. In 1.7, we have these new replacements. We're going to, so this, for 1.6, we're doing an HTTP GET of this endpoint. We're going to do gRPC, or at least custom RPC of connections, NACS, and maybe ACS. And connections is already working on IstioD. NACS may or may not be. Costin says it is. I couldn't make it work. And ACS is not there yet. Proxy status. In 1.6, it used an endpoint called config dump. We don't have that in 1.7. I believe Costin told me in a meeting, and I could the pod and request XDS from Envoy and then ask Envoy for the same thing. Although that makes me think different shards are going to think, both think they're connected to the same proxy, which is crazy. We also use this sync to figure out the sidecar versions. We have a config distribution endpoint, and this one has no corresponding XDS event. So Mitch, you or someone needs to come up with a design.
I've asked Costin for guidance there because I don't understand what this would look like. He promised to write a doc. I haven't seen anything yet.
Yes, so I put it as a blocker at the work group meeting, but he showed up late, so I didn't have a chance to hold his feet to the fire, but we should do that. And then, of course, we had the describe command, which currently does not use a special endpoint, but until recently, it used the authentications endpoint. But that was taken out because the authentications endpoint from Istio is no longer correct. It was returning incorrect information. So we need to, probably me, needs to come up with an XDS event for that as well in similar fashion. And then, of course, if we have any new commands, they might also sort of need this. But that's what I have now. And the other problem, of course, is this stuff talks about the data format once the connection's been established. There still seems to be questions about how that's going to be established. I posted this slide to networking this morning. Haven't got an answer. So when Istio wants to find out about something like proxy status, I believe Costin told me that I could talk to the sleep pod sidecar, have the sleep pod sidecar do an additional XDS on the connection it's already been using to talk to the control plane. But I should not attempt to do a direct connection from my client into the control plane the same way that the pod does. Although I could do this, I've got the code to do that. But I don't believe the code exists for the sleep pod to forward a request on some pod off to Istio. So we also need agreement on that from networking. So those are the items about how this might work. Of course, we want to move away from this to a debug API that is RESTful and maybe more like what a script could use with simple JSON queries. But I think underlying that is going to be this XDS event mechanism, which is why we've been digging so deeply into that. I want to...
Lynn, a lot of this is around central Istio, and I think a few of us are still not exactly clear on specifically what that means. Would you mind taking a few minutes kind of introducing us to the concept?
So I put a link in the troubleshooting document with two links. One is on Costin's XDS event document, and the other is on central Istio. Lynn is on the call, and this is sort of her document. I want to just show the pictures.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. So yeah, so basically, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. So basically in 1.6, we introduced a central Istio flag. We also introduced the Istio remote chat. So the notion is, if you look at the multi-cluster model today we have, we're not really running single control plane. If you ever follow through the multi-cluster shell control plane document, you will realize we're running not only Istio on the first cluster, we are also running Istio for second cluster. So central Istio is really about extract that Istio only running on the first cluster, which could be either the primary cluster for your multi-cluster, or it could be a management cluster for your second cluster. So like in this diagram, you will see on the second cluster, which is the cluster on the right side, there is no Istio-D functionality. So it's going to rely on the Istio-D on the left cluster to serve as a pilot to be able to do XDS serving, to push the configuration to the sleep pods and whatever pods in the mesh, to be able to do Citadel function, to be able to mint the certificate, to be able to distribute the root certificate, and also be able to do sidecar injection and all that by webhook configuration. So on the right side of the cluster, the configuration is really lightweight. You would have the base, if you guys are familiar with the Helm charts we have, you would have the base charts installed, which installs a bunch of our CRDs and installs a bunch of our endpoint and services, mainly to point back to the first cluster on the left side. It also installs the Istio remote chat, which it does is config the validation webhook and also the mutating webhook. So Ed, if you scroll down just slightly, another diagram, which I think IBM is really interested in, is it's similar as this diagram, but you don't want workload on the first cluster. You only run workload on the second cluster. So the first cluster would serve as the main management cluster where it runs Istio-D, and it would have like mesh admin, an administrator, this cluster. And then the second cluster would focus on the user's workload and everything, you know, so it's a clean separation of Istio control plane on one cluster and then the data plane on the second cluster.
So model in the config, like if I was virtual service, I would only do that on the second cluster. Is that right?
Right. In this diagram, the user would only interact with the second cluster. And what Ed was showing on the Istio Kado commands would be, you know, user would be given the second cluster on the right side, and then they would be continue executing their Istio Kado commands to help them to do things.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So add back to your proposal, I do think it makes sense to separate the Istio Kado commands between the admin commands and also the user focus commands, and even some of the commands that focus on installation. I don't even know if it's appropriate to be part of Istio Kado, or definitely needs to be admin command, because now if I'm looking at kubectl, right, the installation of Kubernetes itself is not part of kubectl. And then kubectl actually have the interesting thing, they are grouping the commands to basic commands for beginners and basic commands to intermediate. Then they are also grouping like some of their advanced commands, which they made it clear is for cluster management commands for the admin of the Kubernetes cluster. So they kind of have some type of separation between the level of kube people are expecting to have, the knowledge of kube, and also, you know, whether it's a management command was a user command. So I think that's a good move for us.
I think you're right. So we just need to figure out how to get from where we are to there. And maybe that'll make the install smaller if people are allowed to get just the user istio-ctl versus the admin istio-ctl.
Can I ask a question quickly about the central stuff? Is this like an opinionated, this is how we're doing things from now on, or is this just like one of many multi-cluster topologies still?
This is just one of many, yeah. So this is definitely where people want to move for single control plane. Like the first diagram is where we want to move for single control plane. Certainly, user could run multiple control plane, and each control plane has their own Istio-D that's kind of like our replicated control plane model for multi-cluster. So that model still exists, but this is what we want to move the single control plane model to, and also provide a model for people who wants to run Istio control plane under a management cluster.
Bring up Costin's picture for aggregation of events. He's talking about Istio in two different clusters communicating through these gateways. But this central Istio is nearly working now. So because of this, we need to make sure that things work better. And we've had long-standing requests to make multi-cluster single control plane work better in Istio, and we always punted on it. And for 1.7, we're going to do it. So the question is just how to get all of the pieces in order. And the PR, and I can walk you through that, the PR currently does a single command, proxy status for all the pods. Currently, it talks directly to Istio versus a forward in another pod. Istio is talking to localhost, so it's talking sort of directly to this. But Costin says, well, you can port forward to a workload pod behalf. So let me just show what I have to give people a taste of this. So this version, I mean, we don't want this to be the final way to do it. This is a bit heavy duty. It took me more than 8 hours to write this PR. Or before I show the code, let's just show what the output is. So what this PR does is it makes a second proxy status command that's experimental, which has a few different options. Here is the endpoint. This is a sort of how to talk to Istio. It's not going to use port forward, walking through all of the Istio pods and coalescing. It's going to talk to a single point through this. The output is somewhat the same. I missed the version column, got too big, but and I haven't yet implemented the actual ACK and NAC here. The only thing new is this mesh field. It's a new column. It sort of says what mesh are each of these pods in, because of course there can be more than one pod talking to the same central, more than one mesh talk. Or sorry, this is called mesh. Maybe it should be called cluster. It's unclear. It's called mesh though in the protocol itself. So how can I implement this function? The PR is not big, it's tiny, but there's some new pieces. And I'll just show you what those pieces are. So first there's this URL. It's not a real URL, it's something that's going to be passed to XDS. This is all boilerplate. So I will skip that. We then get to the point where we actually talk to forward. We're using this dial from this helper function that sets up a gRPC client. So it expects that we could talk directly. It may be that in the future that there's a port forward to the workload pod and then a dial to localhost. Right now that port forward to the workload pod is being done out of band by me running command in another window. After the connection is established, we send a discovery request. And this discovery request has a node ID, sort of bogus here. And then the type URL is this new istio.io connections. And then we just wait for the response. This is super quick, much faster than the current one, which has to establish a lot of connections. So we get back the response, and then response comes in the form of these Envoy configurations of nodes. We just unmarshal them and print pretty much in the usual way that we, because I don't have the NACs yet, I just am printing the instance name and namespace. That's the stuff you saw for the first column. Second column is this mesh ID that was part of XDS. And that's basically it. That's the whole thing. There's more that I want to add. I want to add stuff to the dial options for some logging and tracing. This really has no good logging on it. Struggled a lot to get sort of things working. It's currently very brittle. If you make a single mistake with like leave off generator event or something, it doesn't really tell you what the problem was. But it was not hard to use this. I think it is the right way to go.
So question on this, on the remote cluster, if I'm executing the Istio proxy status command on a pod, I guess the proxy status is like overall for the cluster or for a particular pod. Would the Istio would exec into one of the pod on the remote cluster, which would establish a XDS connection back to the Istio on the main cluster, and then be able to retrieve the status, the sync status?
Right. So there's two variants of proxy status. There's the one with no pod name that lists all the pods. And then there's the one where you ask for a single pod, and then it compares the configuration as well. So in the first case, which is all that you saw in that PR, I believe Costin expects Istio to port forward into the sleep pod, and that there will be on the sleep pod a port that will be used for forwarding XDS requests to the control plane. So the sidecar itself, Envoy, has the address of the control plane that it uses. So it already knows how to talk to it, but it only calls it. It has never had a listener that could forward. I believe Costin promised to write me a listener that just forwards to XDS. So I would forward here, and then this existing connection would be able to very quickly add another gRPC thing in addition to the gRPC that has always been done before. And then it would, hopefully I would be all set the same way that it's working now with this direct connection I've implemented. When it turns out that it's going to be the proxy status with a pod, in addition to doing the first thing, I'm going to not ask for all of the connections, but I'm going to ask for the XDS configuration of that pod. So and then I'm going to ask Envoy itself for a config dump. And then the code that is currently in Istio already would then compare the two. So we have code to compare a config dump with something from Pilot. The only thing that's new is we're going to ask Pilot for the config dump using XDS rather than using this debug endpoint.
And does this command work today?
Yes. So the piece, the service that piece has merged. If you check out my PR and build with it, it will work today.
And have we tested against multiple instances of IstioD, horizontally scaled IstioD?
We have not. And Costin has implemented that, and I haven't seen an issue for that. And if he doesn't implement it, then we can't use it for 1.7 because the information will be incorrect. So I need networking or environments to sign off that there'll be a P0 or P1 to deal with the sharded IstioD. And I didn't see on the spreadsheet for the workgroup leaders.
Yeah, I was going to say, but from your sleep pod perspective, it's only you can only configure your sleep pod to point to one control plane, right? So even on the left side, if I'm running multiple revision of the Istio, well, I have canary and base, but at any point of time, the sleep pod is only point to any particular version of Istio, regardless whether you have multiple instances of Istio, right? So as long as the sleep pod knows which Istio it
That,
needs to.
no, I don't think that's the case, Lynn. So what I think is, it's not that there's um, two control planes. Um, the, the problem is there's going to
Also,
be,
I think is broken. There's two problems. There's two instances within one deployment. So it's one logical control plane that's just been horizontally scaled, as Kubernetes does. And then there's the problem of actually running two revisions of the control plane and not having the ability to select between them when you run that command.
well, so we have, so the problem, the first problem, the problem of it being a sharded multiple pods in a single control plane. Yes, Costin has promised, and part of this diagram is these Istio talking to each other as peers to make that happen. In this case, all of these, or at least all of these three, are part of the same revision, same control plane. The second problem, if there's more than one control plane, because you're in the middle of a canary, and there's a related problem, which is if there's no workload pods yet, right? You've just installed Istio and there's no workload pods. You still expect proxy status to say no pods and not, I couldn't figure out how to talk to Istio to ask it. So the question is, if we're going to use method B, going through an existing pod, what do we do if there's none? But if we do method B, there's going to be some pod, some namespace that's only pointing to a single control plane. So if you're running these commands, you may need to give them a namespace argument or a pod argument to let it sort of know which canary control plane you mean.
Right, you do. Or else it could be any one of them.
Right. So,
Revision, yeah.
and I have questions outstanding to environments and networking about this. So one possibility is, well, we installed an Istio operator for each control plane. That was how I was always imagining it worked. Even if you're not installing the control plane yourself, there's an Istio operator that sort of says the user has a main and a canary. Maybe they're both essentially actually Istio system namespace here, but here's two Istio operators that sort of say it. Another possibility is, well, we have these config maps. There's a config map for each revision. So maybe the first thing we do when Istio Cuddle runs is it lists either the operators or these Istio config maps to find how many there are. And if there's more than one, the user has to supply an argument, or it defaults to master, but they supply an argument if they want a canary. That is why I prematurely tried at the previous UX meeting to talk about style guide for how these commands are supposed to find things. But I'm going to be taking this slide tomorrow to environments, and if I get no satisfaction from them, to networking on Thursday, and I'm going to keep asking for issues that are being at P0 or P1 for all of the pieces to get Istio Cuddle to do the full story when it's more complicated than this picture. This picture shows one instance of Istio and one control plane, but you can imagine there being clusters all connected to the same Istio and multiple instances of this control plane. And then you can imagine a canary of it as well. And I need a picture that's complicated so I can make sure that the command line flags are sufficient to identify all that stuff. Thoughts? Or proposals to co-write, or excuse me?
Ed, thanks for tackling this. It looks like quite a complicated problem, and it certainly seems like we're not getting the traction we need from the other working groups to resolve it. But I really appreciate the way that you've approached this and how thorough you've been in making sure that we're getting answers.
Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah, same here as Ed. Really appreciate how deeply you are tackling this and collaborate with the other work groups.
Okay, well, that is all that I had for today.
Can I ask Lynn a few more questions about Central IstioD?
Yeah.
Lynn, are we supporting having multiple clusters connect into the central remote cluster?
I would assume so, yes. So basically you're saying this diagram, there's a third Kubernetes cluster, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I assume so, even though most of our testing only done with 2 clusters right now. But
Okay.
I don't see why you couldn't. I believe the code is also coded assuming you could potentially have more than 2 clusters.
And so then they would be able to put a virtual service in one cluster or the other cluster and have it affect the whole mesh, right?
Oh, so that's a great point. So depends on, so if you look at our single control plane multi-cluster deployment model, we actually assume user would be replicate the virtual service and destination rule and all the network resources across multiple clusters through a CI/CD system. So it's not like automatically because you have to remember there is no pilot, no Istio on the remote cluster that's been listening to the SCD, the config changes, and to be able to propagate the configuration changes.
So, well, it is listening through the gateway, right? Where we have the validation webhook there and that sort of thing, the injector.
Oh yeah, that's just a configuration for the webhooks. So when the webhook runs, it can locate, who's serving the webhooks and allow the validation injection to work properly.
Okay. I would love to have a longer conversation. I know that we don't have time today, but specifically around the relationship between the resource repositories, the Kubernetes API servers, and Central IstioD. I'm curious where we need to not only hear that the object was changed, but actually write a change back to the object. And I'd like to get your opinions on it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Certainly, I haven't tried the status command. Is it doc launch in 1.5 and 1.6? I can probably try it in my environment.
Yeah, it's disabled by default. I'd be interested in seeing how it works.
Yeah, especially for the second cluster. I mean, the first cluster should work exactly the same as single cluster. Yeah, the second cluster is the one, similar challenge as Ed brought up.
So this picture is Lynn's picture, and I showed you Costin's picture. I made my own picture as well, which is this monstrosity. I'm trying to come up with a picture that everyone agrees on. So this picture of mine is supposed to show the complexity that might really be present. Here we have 3 clusters, 1, 2, and 3, 2 users of Istio, and cluster 2 is talking to a central IstioD. Cluster 3 talking to a local IstioD, and cluster 1 is talking to, in one namespace, a central IstioD, but it's in the middle of a canary. So this tries to show all of the domains of permissions. It does not show that central IstioD might be implemented with multiple pods that need to be unsharded, like Costin's does, but it shows what I think is, from a user interface point of view, the fact that there's 2 users collaborating on administration, which we never talk about, And then from a security point of view, sort of all the different pieces that have different levels of security. We need a single diagram we all agree on that combines Lynn's diagram, Costin's diagram, and this. Lynn, have I showed you this before?
No, this is new to me, but it really shows the complexity we have.
Yes. So I can try to make it prettier, but the you know, here we have a guy I'm calling Nuth, who is administering some namespaces, but not others. Like Nuth is administering the Istio system namespace on cluster 3, and Bob is a user of that namespace, but they're sort of both users of cluster 1, and neither one is an administrator of central IstioD. Those are the problems that we need to solve cleanly to make this work. People need to understand, given their permissions, what they can do.
Well, yeah, and there's a new dimension to that, unfortunately, now, Ed, and that is multi-tenancy, which it appears that we're pursuing in 1.7. So not only do they have different directions they'll connect from, but giving Bob information that only Nuth should have will not be allowed.
Exactly. And I think that this talks about it a little bit, but some important feedback I got from Costin was that all of our commands, which currently are cluster-based, should be mesh-based. So when I do proxy status and list all of the proxies, Costin's claim was, well, since this particular instance of central IstioD from this company is administering both production on cluster 1 and some namespace on cluster 2, that proxy status should list this pod and this pod and this pod. And that column mesh, which may mean cluster, or it may mean mesh, I don't know. There needs to be some column that sort of says product page on cluster 2 and product page on cluster 1 prod namespace are different. Okay, well, we've reached the top of the hour. I encourage everyone who loved this to come back next week or in 2 weeks. Everyone who was bored to put your own items on the agenda to discuss.
Thanks so much, Ed. Thanks for coming, Lynn.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, team.